And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly TM spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly TM Podcast. I am your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Here again with another exclusive, proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than General Motors. That's right, Proxyopolists. Following the Proxyopoly scores for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Spotify, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Nvidia, and DWS Group, we now have on the docket today a scathing analysis diving into the corporate governance framework of one of America's largest and most historic auto manufacturers, General Motors. And in keeping with the desire for speed customary of this behemoth of a company, we'll try to wrap up this episode in maybe an hour, maybe two. So sit back, relax, go occupy yourself with a task while you're listening, maybe. Or maybe answer the door, because you know what that is? That's the mail. The proxies are in the mail. They want you to vote them. They want you to hold the board accountable. If you don't know who the proxy is, surprise, the proxy is you. And this episode is brought to you by Proxyopoly TM. If it ain't Proxyopoly TM, you're Proxyopolying. At any rate, and without any further delay, the Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors. Introduction. General Motors, GM, is a century-old industrial institution that has quietly upgraded itself into something more modern, more scalable, and more data-dependent than its, quote, manufacturing company, unquote, branding implies. Its core is still designing, building, and selling vehicles, but its strategic narrative has expanded into software-defined vehicles, connected services, driver assistance and autonomy, platform economics, and a long arc toward electrification. That evolution matters because platform-like businesses don't just sell products, they sell trust, compliance, and continuity, as those attributes are governed or misgoverned from the boardroom. Formally, GM is a Delaware corporation. Its certificate of incorporation establishes a one-share, one-vote common stock structure and authorizes a very large pool of blank check preferred stock, with the board empowered to define series and rights. A standard Delaware flexibility that can be benign until it isn't. GM is headquartered at 300 Renaissance Center in Detroit, and it's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. General Motors' ownership structure does not resemble a controlled company fortress. Instead, it resembles the modern public company norm. Heavy institutional ownership, meaningful index fund blocks, and minimal insider voting dominance. In the most recently accessible definitive proxy materials on Edgar from 2025, GM disclosed that BlackRock Inc. beneficially owned about 12% of the outstanding shares, and the Vanguard Group about 9.7%, based on General Motors Schedule 13G, 13A filings. Meanwhile, GM's board affirmed that all directors other than the CEO are independent, so the board's formal posture is, quote, independent oversight with one management director, unquote, which is governance's version of putting the required reading on the syllabus and hoping anyone does it. This report by Proxyopoly TM applies the Proxyopoly TM ratings framework to General Motors with the same sardonic realism and data-anchored discipline used in prior Proxyopoly TM research reports. The Proxyopoly TM ratings framework and overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is conceptually analogous to beta in the market, designed here to show and estimate how governance power, concentration, and governance behavior can amplify or dampen the real-world impact of a single proxy vote. The basic logic is straightforward. In companies where shareholder voices can meaningfully affect outcomes and oversight is credible, proxy mechanics are stabilizing. In companies where shareholder power is procedurally constrained or where management can treat serious compliance failures as, quote, just another quarter, unquote, proxy dynamics become destabilizing. General Motors, in this analysis, earns a Proxyopoly TM profile that is not a caricature of oligarchic control, but it is also not a shareholder utopia. Its governance system mixes meaningful shareholder rights, such as proxy access and annual director elections, with structural and behavioral features that harden management's position, notably the dual chair and CEO roles, such in addition to limited shareholder action by written consent, board-filled vacancies, and increasingly consequential compliance controversies linked to data and automated driving governance. To put it bluntly, General Motors is not a proxy monopoly, it is a proxy utility so large, so embedded in regulated life, and so connected to consumer data that governance failures can spill beyond shareholders into regulators, courts, and the general public. This spillover risk is exactly what Proxyopoly TM is built to quantify. And just like that, Proxyopolists, we're already on to Section 2, the Proxyopoly TM ratings. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1, Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR. By definition, proxy accumulation resistance measures how difficult it is for outside investors to accumulate sufficient voting influence to alter corporate control, board composition, or policy outcomes. Higher positive proxy accumulation resistance indicates a company where accumulating decisive proxy influence is practically difficult even without exotic share classes because the ownership base, market structure, and voting ecosystem function with friction. A negative proxy accumulation resistance would suggest relatively low resistance, the kind of company where activists can credibly threaten a board reset with action. In this analysis, General Motors' ownership profile is not a dictatorship by design. It is a democracy with heavy furniture. There is one class of common stock with one vote per share. General Motors' CEO is not shielded by founder-controlled supervotes, and there is no disclosed controlling shareholder with a majority. In principle, that should reduce PAR. Keyword being should. Yet, proxy accumulation resistance is not just about whether a founder owns 50% plus one share or more. It is about whether any plausible coalition can assemble enough votes to overcome the default setting of modern proxy voting. Passive institutional ownership, low turnout among dispersed holders, and a structural bias toward continuity absent a crisis compelling enough to unify large institutions. In 2025 proxy disclosures, GM reported two very large beneficial holders, BlackRock and Vanguard. Those positions do not constitute control, but they do mean that any meaningful proxy campaign must persuade a small number of gatekeepers whose incentive structure is often, quote, minimize tracking error and reputational risk, unquote, not, quote, win a knife fight at the annual meeting, unquote. GM's contestability is further dampened by size and complexity. A real proxy contest requires A. Credible alternative strategy. B. Credible board slate. C. Credible path to implementation. And D. Enough investor conviction to overcome inertia. For a regulated, capital-intensive automaker, particularly one simultaneously managing internal combustion profitability, an EV transition, software and data monetization, and autonomous tech risk, activists face a higher evidentiary burden than in simpler businesses. That burden focuses as a proxy friction, not legally prohibitive, but practically meaningful. Finally, GM's capital allocation program, large-scale buybacks and dividend increases, can also reduce the pool of swing shares over time and increase the relative importance of the remaining institutional blocks. In its Q4 2025 earnings communications, the company emphasized substantial repurchases and ongoing authorization, with decision-making framed as disciplined capital allocation. Capital returns can be shareholder-friendly, but they can also function as political insulation. Returning cash buys goodwill, and goodwill is the oldest anti-activism technology in corporate history. Overall, GM's proxy accumulation resistance is modestly positive, reining in at positive 0.25. There is no true control block, but the practical pathways to assembling a winning external coalition are meaningfully resisted by institutional structure and, quote, continuity bias, unquote. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.25 for the proxy accumulation resistance of General Motors. Moving on to the next Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Bylaw Fortification Index. And that is Proxyopoly TM rating number 2. Keep up with me, Proxyopolists. The Bylaw Fortification Index measures how corporate governance rules, charter provisions, bylaws, procedural requirements, and related defenses fortify management and incumbent directors against shareholder-led change. The Bylaw Fortification Index rises with constraints such as limits on written consent, board control over vacancies, tight nomination windows, and other mechanisms that make shareholder power real in theory, but operationally inconvenient in practice. In this analysis, GM does not rely on the classic poison pill as personality. Instead, it relies on the more durable tool, procedure. Start with the charter. GM's amended and restated certificate of incorporation states that, quote, no director or officer shall be personally liable for monetary damages for breach of fiduciary duty to the fullest extent permitted by Delaware law, subject to enumerated exceptions, unquote. This is a post-2022 Delaware incorporation trend of officer exculpation that many companies have adopted. But from a Proxyopoly TM lens, the point is less, is this legal? And more, what does it do to accountability incentives? GM's shareholder base approved the amended charter at the 2025 annual general meeting. The practical effect is to reduce personal downside risk for senior decision makers when governance fails, precisely when shareholders need credible deterrence. Next, the charter's constraint on shareholder action by written consent is unusually blunt. No action that must be taken at an annual or special meeting may be effected by written consent, except by unanimous consent of all shares entitled to vote. In plain English, that means that shareholders cannot act between meetings as a practical matter. This is a genuine fortification feature. It forces governance energy into management-controlled meeting cycles, with management-controlled agendas, meeting formats, and logistics. Then there is board control over vacancies. The charter states that vacancies and newly created directorships shall be filled exclusively by board resolution. Again, this is common enough in Delaware incorporated companies, yet its governance effect is unambiguous. If shareholders succeed in withholding support from one director, the next step is not necessarily shareholders pick the replacement. The board does. That is not a democracy, it is a self-repairing machine. GM's bylaws preserve shareholder rights but wrap them in procedural conditions that can be heavy. Shareholders holding at least 15% of the voting power can request a special meeting, but the bylaws require substantial disclosures and allow the board to decline to call the meeting under enumerated conditions, including if the board already scheduled a meeting within 90 days. This is rights with friction. The corporate equivalent of offering a customer service portal that always seems to be under maintenance. GM's advance notice framework is also robust. To bring nominations or other business, shareholders must comply with detailed notice requirements and timing windows, generally 120 to 180 days before the anniversary of the prior annual meeting, subject to exceptions. Such provisions are not inherently abusive, but they do raise bylaw fortification index because they increase the cost and expertise required to exercise shareholder voice. On the shareholder-friendly side, GM's proxy access bylaw is meaningful. A shareholder or group up to 20 shareholders holding at least 3% for at least 3 years may nominate up to 20% of the board, or 2 directors, whichever is greater, for inclusion in the proxy statement. That feature reduces bylaw fortification index because it provides a lower cost pathway to board access if shareholders can meet the threshold and manage procedural requirements. Moreover, GM's October 2024 bylaw amendment removed a resignation letter requirement previously imposed on proxy access nominees, which is a shareholder-friendly cleanup and a rare example of a company making administrative updates that actually reduce a governance booby trap rather than installing one. Even after crediting these positives, General Motors BFI remains above neutral, and Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.65 in the bylaw fortification index for General Motors. The combination of 1. No practical written consent. 2. Board control over vacancies. 3. Procedural density in special meetings and nominations. 4. Broad board power over bylaws. And 5. Expanded officer exculpation constitutes a set of fortifications that meaningfully harden incumbent power. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 3. Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or SHQ. By definition, shareholder hostility quotient evaluates management and board responsiveness to shareholders, especially minority shareholders, based on posture, engagement, transparency, and willingness to incorporate shareholder feedback. A higher SHQ indicates a cultural and procedural tendency to treat shareholders as an obstacle course rather than co-owners. In this analysis, General Motors markets its governance culture with the familiar language of independence, engagement, and oversight. Its board describes strong and independent leadership and explicitly notes an independent lead director structure even while combining the chair and CEO roles. It also claims a structured shareholder engagement program and committee oversight of governance, as well as sustainability topics. However, shareholder hostility quotient is driven less by brochures and more by outcomes and incentives, especially when things go wrong. Consider executive accountability and shareholder signaling. In May 2024, Proxy Advisor Institutional Shareholder Services recommended that General Motors shareholders vote against the company's executive compensation proposal, citing pay for performance misalignment and insufficient mitigating factors. Proxy advisory recommendations are not gospel by any means, but they are an example of a smoke alarm externally. When a proxy advisor argues that targets were set below prior year levels while pay remained high, it directly implicates board posture toward shareholder value and accountability. Now consider GM's own governance actions. Shareholders approved a charter update that added officer exculpation language, reducing potential monetary liability exposure for certain fiduciary duty claims, Regardless of legal merits, the optics are brutally simple. In a period defined by increasingly consequential safety, privacy, and autonomy governance risks, GM asked shareholders for a legal insulation upgrade. That is not hostility in the cartoonish sense. It is hostility in the quiet, professional sense, which is also the kind that arrives via PDF and has lasting consequences. Shareholder hostility quotient is also influenced by meeting mechanics and voice. GM's bylaws allow the board, in its sole discretion, to hold a virtual meeting, quote, in addition to or instead of a physical meeting, unquote, as permitted by Delaware law. Virtual meetings can expand access, but they can also reduce genuine confrontation and compress shareholder discourse into curated Q&A flows. Proxyopoly TM treats unilateral discretion toward virtual-only formats as a modest shareholder friction variable unless counterbalanced by strong procedural commitments to open dialogue. Perhaps most importantly, shareholder hostility quotient must incorporate how General Motors responds to reputationally intense governance controversies, because those controversies expose whether shareholder rights are operationally meaningful or merely decorative. GM's recent governance controversies are not limited to the usual, quote, somebody disliked the EPS bridge, unquote. They include alleged consumer privacy violations tied to connected vehicle data and major automated driving compliance issues tied to its autonomous subsidiary. These are not irrelevant to shareholders. They affect legal exposure, cost structure, customer trust, brand equity, and regulatory constraints on future growth. A board that oversees a business transitioning into connected services monetization but allows or fails to prevent a major privacy enforcement episode signals that stakeholder risk management is not being treated as a core shareholder value variable. Finally, voting outcomes provide an empirical hint about shareholder sentiment. At General Motors 2025 Annual General Meeting, shareholders cast meaningful against votes for certain directors. Notably, the CEO and the independent lead director, even though all were subsequently re-elected. A company can interpret this as either A, feedback worth internalizing, or B, background noise surviving only because corporate democracy allows dissent as long as it is non-lethal. Proxyopoly TM, in its shareholder hostility quotient analysis, assumes dissent matters only if the board treats it as a signal. In sum, GM's shareholder hostility quotient is meaningfully positive. And Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.90 for the shareholder hostility quotient of General Motors, because the company exhibits a structural and behavioral tilt toward managerial convenience, procedural discretion, liability insulation, and continuity, while simultaneously operating a business model that increasingly requires high trust governance. The mismatch between trust-dependent strategy and insulation-oriented governance increments is precisely what drives this shareholder hostility quotient upward for General Motors. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4, the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or EEF. By definition, executive entrenchment factor measures how insulated top leadership is from replacement or meaningful discipline beyond what normal performance-based job security would provide. It weighs structural leadership choices, such as the CEO-chair duality, board mechanics, succession transparency, and the extent to which accountability levers are practical rather than theoretical. In this analysis, GM's executive entrenchment story begins with the most direct fact. The CEO is also the chairperson. GM's proxy materials state that the board has determined it is in the company's best interest to combine the roles of CEO and chair with Mary Barra to elect an independent lead director. In addition, the CEO, Mary Barra, has served since 2014 and has been chair since 2016. CEO-chair duality is not automatically governance malpractice, but it is unambiguously entrenchment positive. It concentrates agenda control, narrative control, and power over boardroom information pathways in a single person. GM attempts to offset that with an independent lead director role, complete with defined responsibilities, including overseeing CEO evaluation and succession planning. This mitigates EEF slightly, but it does not neutralize it. The lead director role is still a counterweight within a structure where the CEO holds the gavel. GM's committee structure reinforces management centrality. The proxy statement describes an executive committee chaired by the chair CEO that acts on certain limited matters between board meetings. The existence of such a committee is not unusual, but when the CEO chairs it, the oversight architecture tilts further toward executive control of cadence and decisions. Charter mechanics also matter. Vacancies and newly created directorships are filled exclusively by the board. That means even if shareholders successfully pressure a director to resign or fail to secure majority support, shareholders do not automatically gain the ability to install a replacement in real time. In an entrenchment model, boards that can self-fill vacancies are boards that can maintain continuity even when shareholders object. Then there is liability insulation. The Charter's officer exculpation language reduces monetary liability exposure for certain fiduciary duty claims, subject to exceptions. This can be defended as talent retention and risk management. Proxyopoly TM interprets it more cynically, but also more empirically. Reducing personal downside risk is a form of entrenchment because it lowers the expected cost of decisions that later prove harmful when paired with complex, high-risk domains such as autonomy, data privacy, and safety. This effect is non-trivial. Executive pay design also ties directly into entrenchment. In 2024 and previous years, Proxy Advisor Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, publicly argued that General Motors' executive compensation proposal reflected pay-for-performance misalignment. Even if say-on-pay votes remain broadly supportive in aggregate, a credible misalignment critique from a major proxy advisor indicates that the compensation system may not be delivering a sufficiently sharp accountability function. To GM's credit, shareholder mechanics for director elections are not particularly entrenching. Directors are elected annually. It is not a classified board, and voting results are disclosed in a conventional manner. GM also maintains proxy access at a meaningful threshold, 3% or 3 years. Those features do lower executive entrenchment factor to a truly entrenched board relatively in comparison. However, executive entrenchment factor incorporates more than election mechanics. It incorporates how difficult it is to force leadership change or strategic correction when governance controversies occur. On one of the most significant strategic fronts is autonomous driving. General Motors' own 2025 Form 10-K emphasizes that it has, quote, refocused, unquote, its autonomous vehicle strategy, acquired remaining non-controlling interests in its autonomous subsidiary, and wound down the robotaxi plan in favor of a less capital-intensive approach. The pivot itself is not the entrenchment problem. The question is how long the prior strategy persisted and whether the board's oversight mechanisms were sufficiently aggressive before regulators and public controversy forced a reset. That gap between oversight aspiration and event-driven correction is the practical footprint of entrenchment. GM's executive entrenchment factor is therefore meaningfully positive. Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.20 for the executive entrenchment factor of General Motors. Noting the CEO-chair duality, the board self-filling vacancies, and liability insulation collectively raise leadership security above what neutral governance would otherwise imply. This especially applies for a company operating in domains where regulators can also become de facto shareholder advocates when governance fails. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 5. Regulatory Evasion Measure, or REM. By definition, regulatory evasion measure assesses a company's propensity to draw enforcement actions, legal sanctions, consent orders, or significant regulatory disputes, especially where the underlying posture suggests skirt-the-edge compliance, weak controls, or a pattern of fix-it-when-caught Higher regulatory evasion measures reflect increased governance risk from legal and regulatory exposure. In this analysis, General Motors' regulatory evasion measure is the primary driver of its overall Proxyopoly TM risk profile, because GM's recent regulatory controversies are not minor, stale, or isolated. They are contemporary examples of how a legacy manufacturer can stumble when it behaves like a data platform without building platform-grade compliance ethics. Noting the connected vehicle data and the Federal Trade Commission regime. In January 2026, well, that's just a few months ago, the Federal Trade Commission announced it finalized an order settling allegations that GM and OnStar collected, used, and sold consumers' precise geolocation and driver behavior data without adequate consent. The Federal Trade Commission described the conduct in unusually sharp terms and imposed a significant set of restrictions, including a 5-year ban on disclosure of geolocation and driver behavior data to consumer reporting agencies and long-term compliance obligations in addition to that. Reuters' coverage of the controversy similarly described the settlement as a 5-year ban and emphasized that the FTC alleged data was collected and sold without drivers' knowledge or consent and used in reports affecting insurance outcomes. This is not a paperwork error. It is a governance and control failure in the company's connected services monetization channel. The Federal Trade Commission's complaint in its materials describe allegations that the enrollment process was misleading and that consumers were not clearly informed that data would be shared with and sold to third parties. When a company's connected vehicle strategy is built on trust and continued access to consumer data flows, an FTC order of this magnitude is not just legal risk, it is strategic risk. GM's own 2025 10K filing describes privacy and consumer protection exposure related to its former OnStar Smart Driver product, including punitive class actions consolidated into multi-district litigation and state enforcement matters, and notes that General Motors resolved an FTC investigation through an administrative consent order. That disclosure confirms the controversy is not merely media noise. It is an enterprise-level legal exposure discussed in Securities Exchange Commission filings. Another issue is the autonomous driving, cruise, and federal crash reporting compliance. GM's autonomous subsidiary, called Cruise, has been subject to intense scrutiny following a high-profile October 2nd, 2023 incident in which an automated vehicle dragged a pedestrian after a collision initiated by another car. In September 2024, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration announced a consent order with Cruise addressing incomplete reporting under NHTSA's Standing General Order for crashes involving automated driving systems, explicitly citing failures to disclose post-crash details of that incident. Associated reporting described financial penalties and federal oversight requirements tied to crash reporting compliance. Another report by Reuters reported that NHTSA closed a probe into certain cruise issues after a software recall, but also noted ongoing investigations by the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission related to the incident, along with regulatory penalties and scrutiny from California regulators. Even where investigations close, the story remains REM positive, because the pattern is major incident to regulatory action to compliance remediation. Proxyopoly TM does not reward companies for eventually installing a seatbelt. In this metaphor, GM's 2025 10K further indicates a strategic reorientation. GM acquired the remaining non-controlling interests in Cruise and wound down the robotaxi plan in favor of a refocused autonomous vehicle strategy. Again, that is a business decision, but it is also evidence of governance correction after governance stress. Another issue is vehicle safety and recall disputes. GM operates in a naturally high regulation risk environment. Some REM is baseline, but GM's recent disclosures include significant ongoing safety-related disputes, including Takata inflator matters and a still contested airbag inflator dispute involving ARC Delphi inflators referenced in the 2025 10K. Independent regulatory documentation reflects the seriousness of such airbag issues. NHTSA issued a supplemental decision in 2024 addressing whether certain inflators contain a defect, reflecting the complexity and scale of safety oversight facing automakers and suppliers. GM also discloses significant litigation accruals and a broad set of legal proceedings, such as transmission-related litigation, an ESG topic, recall-related matters, and other product and consumer claims that are expensive even when resolved. Finally, the last issue impacting regulatory evasion measure is regulatory change risk and policy-aligned strategy pivots. GM's regulatory exposure also intersects with emissions and electric vehicle policy volatility. This is, again, an ESG topic. GM's 10K discusses evolving U.S. federal emissions and fuel economy regulation and the role of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as California Air Resources Board in emissions standards, including uncertainty around regulatory consideration. In earnings communications, GM explicitly framed its 2025 EV restructuring and its shifts in investment cadence as partly influenced by policy changes, tax incentives, and emissions regulations stringency. The Proxyopoly TM relevance is that high regulatory volatility increases the temptation for, quote, compliance by messaging, unquote, rather than compliance by durable systems. And even though the regulatory environment in this current political regime surrounding environmental factors, it's like whiplash, it's something to take into consideration in the regulatory evasion measure. And for General Motors, the regulatory evasion measure is therefore elevated. Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.60 for the regulatory evasion measure of General Motors. General Motors has faced major recent consumer privacy enforcement, culminating in a long-term FTC order, high-profile automated driving compliance failures via its autonomous vehicle subsidiary, and ongoing safety and litigation complexity typical of automakers but still material. These are governance control failures with systemic spillovers, precisely the kind that can amplify the market impact of proxy oversight decisions. Having now laid on the table all of the Proxyopoly TM ratings underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors, we have time for a short intermission before we reveal the final Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors. So enjoy this brief message from our sponsors.
Hello, Proxyopolists, and welcome to Season 4 of the Proxyopoly TM podcast. I'm an unnamed Proxyopolist, anonymously submitting my sponsorship for this podcast series and this intermission you're now listening to. But you can call me Proxy Zero. And if I were an investment manager at an unnamed mutual fund housing of sorts, I would be looking for a new proxy advisor with certain sets of skills. Perhaps one not even a proxy advisor by nature. One who could provide all of the research and analysis at a smaller cost, but even a much larger scale than typical proxy advisors. You see, your typical proxy advisor won't publish research or recommendations on proxy votes for private companies. But let's say the season finale of this podcast were to talk about a private company that might be having an IPO. Wouldn't that be of something of interest to Proxyopolis everywhere? Yes, I Proxy Zero would certainly love to hear more information about this private company that would be possibly issuing its initial public offering. Could this be the company supplying artificial intelligence? Are the artificial intelligence solutions really practical in these days? I mean, isn't everything just AI washed, like everything was greenwashed a couple months ago? Or a couple years? Who knows? But if you're going to rebrand something as being driven by AI, shouldn't it have some fucking brains? Anyway, if you're looking for sponsored content or contributed content on this podcast like I'm doing right now, contact Proxyopoly TM today. Guess it ain't Proxyopoly. You're Proxyopoly.
And we're back, Proxyopolists. Moving on to Section 3, the final Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors. GM's final Proxyopoly TM score is calculated as a normalized weighted average of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings to a 2 decimal point precision. Summarizing and recapping what you've heard in Section 2, we're going to talk about the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings now. For proxy accumulation resistance, PAR, General Motors has been designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.25. For the Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI, General Motors has been designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.65. Proxyopoly TM rating number 3, Shareholder Hostility Quotient. Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.90. For the Executive Entrenchment Factor, Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.20. For the Fifth and final Proxyopoly TM rating. Proxyopoly TM has designated a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.60 in the regulatory evasion measure. Thus, we now have a calculation for the final Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors. And we will now be proceeding with the proprietary calculation methods.
Oh, we're so close. Oh, shit, we're almost there.
The final Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors is positive 0.92. Interpretation. A Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.92 places General Motors meaningfully above the Proxyopoly TM baseline, the neutral of 0.00. The proxy zero, if you will. This is not proxy monopoly territory, but it is firmly in the zone where governance controversy and compliance failures create outsized externalities. That outcome is driven by regulatory evasion measure primarily, citing privacy enforcement and autonomous vehicle compliance issues, reinforced by executive entrenchment factor, noting the CEO chair duality and insulation mechanics, and structurally supported by bylaw fortification index with no practical written consent, board-filled vacancies, and procedural density. A crucial nuance to note in the analysis: GM's industry matters. Automakers interact with public safety, emissions policy, consumer finance, and increasingly consumer data. Governance failures at GM, therefore, risk becoming regulatory architecture changes, such as tougher enforcement regimes, broader disclosure obligations, stricter crash reporting rules that affect the whole sector. The more systemic the company's footprint, the more its governance volatility matters. Hence, the score's upward tilt. Now moving on to section 4 of this podcast. The governance policy change recommendation section. The Proxyopoly TM reform agenda for General Motors is not, quote, tear down the charter and start again, unquote. General Motors is not structurally irredeemable. The problem is that GM is trying to become a higher trust, higher software, higher data enterprise, while retaining governance mechanics outdated, optimized for a lower trust industrial era where privacy compliance was not an existential business variable. The following lists are targeted reforms that would materially lower General Motors' Proxyopoly TM risk profile, helping it achieve a more neutral Proxyopoly TM score closer to 0.00. Governance policy change recommendation number 1. Separate the CEO and chair roles, or adopt a binding, time-bound transition policy. GM explicitly affirms it has chosen to combine CEO and chairperson roles while using an independent lead director as counterweight. Proxyopoly TM views this as insufficient for a company with elevated regulatory evasion measure, citing FTC enforcement and autonomous vehicle compliance. General Motors should either A. separate the roles within a defined time frame, for example at the next CEO succession event, or B. adopt a formal policy that the chair will be independent unless the board makes a specific, annually renewed finding that combining roles is necessary. The governance goal is not symbolism. It is ensuring that board agenda control and CEO performance accountability do not sit in the same hands in a risk-heavy strategy regime. Governance policy recommendation for change number 2. Restore practical shareholder action by written consent, or materially strengthen between meeting shareholder rights. GM's charter effectively prohibits written consent except unanimity. Proxyopoly treats this as shareholder friction fortification. If GM will not permit written consent, it should materially strengthen special meeting rights by reducing thresholds below 15% and reducing procedural burdens for requesting shareholders while preserving reasonable anti-abuse safeguards. Either path reduces bylaw fortification index by making shareholder power operational, not ceremonial. Governance policy change recommendation number 3. Adopt a connected data fiduciary governance framework overseen by an empowered board committee. The Federal Trade Commission's finalized order highlights how damaging data monetization failures can be. GM should establish an explicit board-level governance framework that treats consumer data stewardship as a fiduciary-like duty, with consent clarity, data minimization, third-party governance, auditability, and deletion controls. The board should require quarterly reporting on compliance metrics, third-party data sharing, and consumer opt-out flows. The program should be audited by an independent third party with board-facing reporting, not just management-facing dashboards. Governance policy change recommendation number 4. Tie executive compensation to verifiable compliance and trust metrics with meaningful malice clawback triggers. Proxy Advisor ISS's critique of pay for performance alignment should be treated as a warning sign, even if say on pay passes comfortably. General Motors should incorporate compensation triggers tied to A. Material privacy enforcement events, B. Material safety reporting failures, and C. Recurring regulatory non-compliance. The clawback tool must be credible, triggered by enforcement findings and sustained over multi-year periods, not waived for retention. If GM is becoming a software services business, trust events like these must be priced into pay. Governance policy change recommendation number 5. increase transparency on autonomy governance, including reporting integrity and regulator engagement protocols. NHTSA's cruise consent order arose from incomplete crash reporting disclosures. General Motors should adopt and disclose a board-appointed autonomy governance policy requiring A. Full and timely regulator reporting, B. An internal escalation protocol that bypasses business leaders when compliance risk is high, and C. A board committee review of autonomous vehicle incident reporting. A public company's reputation does not survive, quote, we forgot to mention the part where the car dragged a person, unquote, as a governance posture. Governance policy change recommendation number 6. Limit board discretion on virtual-only meetings and adopt minimum shareholder access standards. General Motors bylaws allow virtual-only meetings at the board's sole discretion. Proxyopoly TM recommends that General Motors adopt a shareholder access policy. If meetings are virtual, the company must commit to robust real-time Q&A. Publish all substantive questions and answers post-meeting, with limited exceptions, and disclose vote results with clarity. If GM wants to reduce the shareholder hostility quotient, it must treat shareholders less like users and more like owners. Governance policy change recommendation number 7. Rebalance the charter's accountability posture post-officer exculpation via enhanced disclosure and board evaluation discipline. A lot of 2-cent words in that one, don't you think? GM's charter now includes officer liability limitations. Proxyopoly TM recommends offsetting that insulation with stronger accountability substitutes. Annual board evaluation disclosure, at least at a high level. Explicit articulation of how the board disciplines executives for compliance failures, and independent committee authority to retain outside counsel and investigators without management approval in privacy safety matters. These reforms, outlined by Proxyopoly TM, are not ideological. They are economic, as in the economic best interest of General Motors and its shareholders as a public company. In a connected vehicle world, trust failures create enforcement regimes that cost money, constrain strategy, and degrade brand equity. General Motors can either pre-commit to stronger governance or keep paying the surprise compliance tax as a cost of doing business. Having now wrapped up Section 4, before diving into the Proxyopoly TM Board of Voting recommendations for General Motors, we're going to take a short intermission to allow the Proxyopolist at home to take a break. Do whatever it is you do. Put your left hand, you're going to follow my instructions. Put your left hand behind your head. Raise your right hand in the air. Look in the mirror, turn the lights off, and say, Proxy zero, proxy zero, proxy zero.
Now it is time for a word from our sponsors. Hi, I'm Proxy Zero. Before we dive into the next section, the board voting recommendations section, it's a wonder why it's difficult to find a sponsor for this podcast, because what company would want someone talking about whether or not their board should be re-elected? But someone's got to do it, and that's what Proxyopoly is for. Thanks for listening, Proxyopolis. And if you sit on the board of a company that has been voted against, and you would like to go on this podcast to try to defend yourself, the invitation is outstanding. You just gotta contact Proxyopoly. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled Proxyopoly programming.
Now moving on to the fifth and final section of this podcast episode, the Proxyopoly TM voting recommendations for the 2026 annual general meeting of General Motors. The recommendations that follow are according to Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines. Supporting directors who strengthen independent oversight and strategic resilience, withholding support from directors whose roles and tenure align with entrenchment, pay misalignment, and risk oversight failures, especially where there have been significant governance controversies with regulatory consequences. First director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Mary T. Barra, chairperson and CEO of General Motors. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Ms. Barra based on CEO chair duality and the entrenchment profile that follows from combining agenda control and management evaluation into one individual, even with a lead independent director as counterweight. GM's most consequential governance controversies in the last business cycle are consumer data enforcement and autonomous driving compliance failures through its subsidiary ecosystem, and are exactly the risk domains where concentrated leadership structures underperform. The company's pivot away from the robo-taxi plan underscores that strategic oversight has been reactive to external pressure rather than proactively risk-governed. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Wesley G. Bush, Compensation Committee Chair, Audit, Finance, Executive Member. Proxyopoly TM board voting recommendation: vote against or withhold support from. Due to his central role in executive pay design in a period when external governance signals flagged misalignment, including proxy advisor ISS's recommendation against executive compensation. Compensation oversight is not an abstract duty at GM. It is a core control mechanism in a trust-dependent strategy environment. Persistent major regulatory controversies, such as the Federal Trade Commission and autonomous vehicle reporting issues, require a compensation system that meaningfully prices compliance risk, and Proxyopoly TM sees insufficient evidence that pay has been a strong deterrent rather than a reward for continuity. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Joanne C. Crevoiserat, Audit, Finance, Governance Member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Because her profile aligns with shareholder-relevant oversight, audit, literacy, finance experience, and governance committee service with a relatively shorter board tenure compared to long-serving incumbents. While GM's overall compliance profile remains concerning, Proxyopoly TM prioritizes retaining directors positioned to improve disclosure, financial oversight, and board refreshment rather than treating the board as a collectively irredeemable entity. Her background in consumer brands and data-driven initiatives is relevant as GM leans into software and connected services, provided governance systems follow suit. Next director of the board for re-election on the docket today is Joseph Jimenez, Finance Committee Chair, Compensation Executive Risk Member. Proxyopoly TM Board Voting Recommendation, ABSTAIN. Proxyopoly TM recommends ABSTAIN because his committee portfolio is both valuable and problematic. He chairs Finance Committee and sits on committees implicated in capital allocation, pay design, and enterprise risk. GM has delivered significant capital returns and financial discipline narratives, but the company's elevated regulatory evasion measure suggests that enterprise risk oversight in privacy and autonomous vehicle compliance has not matched the sophistication of financial engineering. ABSTAIN reflects this ambivalence. He brings serious regulated industry leadership experience, but the board's risk outcomes during his tenure warrant a stronger accountability signal than a routine 4. Next director of the board for re-election on the docket today is Alfred F. Kelly Jr., Audit and Risk and Cybersecurity Member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation vote 4. Proxyopoly TM recommends 4 because he is a relatively new director, elected effective September 2024, and is therefore less plausibly responsible for legacy governance failures that culminated enforcement. He was subsequently designated to the Audit Committee and Risk and Cybersecurity Committee, roles that are directly relevant to rebuilding governance credibility around data stewardship and reporting controls. Proxyopoly TM treats his election as an opportunity for remediation capacity, particularly given his background leading payments networks where trust and compliance are essential, not optional. Next director of the board for re-election on the docket today is Jonathan McNeill, Governance Committee Member, Vice Chair of Cruise Board as disclosed. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote against or withhold support from. Proxyopoly TM recommends vote against or withhold support from because his disclosed proximity to the autonomous subsidiary's governance ecosystem, including board-level involvement, ties him more directly than most directors to the autonomous vehicle controversy and rebuilding trust with regulators narrative. NHTSA's consent order addressing incomplete crash reporting disclosures is the kind of compliance breakdown that board-level oversight should prevent, not explain after the fact. A withhold vote or against vote functions as targeted accountability for autonomous vehicle governance, performance, and transparency, especially given GM's ultimate retreat from the robotaxi plan. Next director of the board for re-election on the docket today is Judith A. Miscik, Finance, Risk, and Cybersecurity Member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote against. Proxyopoly TM recommends against, in this case, because her committee assignments cover precisely the domains implicated by GM's most severe current enforcement and risk events: consumer data privacy and enterprise risk governance. GM's Federal Trade Commission settlement over alleged collection and sale of geolocation and driving behavior data without adequate consent reflects a failure of governance controls around connected services, an area that should sit squarely in risk oversight. Where enforcement outcomes are this blunt, Proxyopoly TM treats risk committee members as accountable unless there is unusually strong evidence of proactive correction before regulators arrive. Next director of the board for re-election on the docket today is Patricia F. Russo, Independent Lead Director, Governance Committee Chair, Finance Compensation Executive Member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote withhold. Because governance architecture is her core remit, and GM's architecture still exhibits meaningful fortification and entrenchment features, such as CEO chair duality, no practical written consent, board-filled vacancies, and expanded officer exculpation. The board explicitly states that it has determined combining CEO and chairperson roles is in the company's best interest, and that she serves as lead independent director, making Ms. Russo the formal counterweight in a structure that Proxyopoly TM views as entrenchment positive. A withhold vote signals that shareholders expect the governance committee to reduce procedural fortifications and increase accountability substitutes, especially in a period of elevated REM or regulatory evasion measure. And this is not an against vote of the lead independent director, provided that ousting the lead independent director while also ousting the CEO chairperson in this slate of recommendations would be counterintuitive. Ergo, withhold from the lead independent director, vote against the chairperson CEO. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Mark A. Tatum. Audit governance member, Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote for. Proxyopoly TM recommends for because Mr. Tatum's governance committee membership aligns with shareholder engagement, board composition oversight, and long-term strategic perspective, and there is not a specific evidence tying him to the most acute compliance failures as a primary oversight actor. Proxyopoly TM also recognizes the value of retaining directors who can credibly challenge brand strategy and customer trust issues, relevant in a connected services era, while still using targeted withhold votes for those morally directly aligned with entrenchment and risk oversight failures, and holding those accountable with an against vote. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Jan E. Teague, Audit, Risk, and Cybersecurity member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote abstain. Proxyopoly TM recommends abstain with caution. Her experience is explicitly rooted in cybersecurity and intelligence-related operational leadership, which is relevant as GM's enterprise risk exposure expands to include data privacy regimes and AI-related compliance complexity, while the risk oversight system has not prevented major privacy enforcement. Proxyopoly TM views directors with domain expertise as necessary for remediation, especially when paired with accountability actions directed at leadership, structure, and committee chairs. However, the primary driver for the abstain vote is caution due to Ms. Teague's overboarding as also sitting on the board of Goldman Sachs. This will allow some areas of expertise, but Proxyopoly TM does explicitly note some concerns with overboarding here. Ergo, the abstain vote is warranted. The last director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Devin N. Wenig, Compensation Committee member. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote for. Because his technology and AI-adjacent leadership experience is relevant to GM's transition toward software-defined vehicles and connected services, and his committee role can be constructive if compensation is redesigned to price trust and compliance risk. Proxyopoly TM is not giving a blank check. The recommendation is contingent on a visible shift in pay governance toward compliance-linked incentives and clawbacks tied to enforcement events. His 10-year role do not, on the available record, place him at the center of the most severe governance failures in the same way as the CEO chair duality and governance committee leadership do. Arriving at the conclusion of this podcast, the final Proxyopoly score for General Motors of positive 0.92 is the portrait of a company that is not structurally captured by a controlling shareholder, yet is meaningfully exposed to modern governance volatility. The core problem is not that GM lacks shareholder rights entirely. It is that its governance mechanics and leadership structure are calibrated for an era when compliance mostly means emissions testing and recall logistics, as GM is now monetizing software, data, and autonomy. The Proxyopoly TM ratings highlight a specific pattern. GM's proxy accumulation resistance is only mildly resistant because ownership is not dominated by a single controller, but the institutional voting ecosystem creates real friction for challengers. GM's bylaw fortification index is meaningfully fortified due to procedural and charter-based insulation, no practical written consent, board-filled vacancies, and a governance posture that increasingly embraces liability insulation while maintaining board discretion over meeting formats. GM's shareholder hostility quotient and executive entrenchment factor reflect the culture, and structure, tilt toward continuity, centered on CEO chairperson duality and a compensation accountability story that has attracted credible external criticism. But the real driver is regulatory evasion measure. The Federal Trade Commission's finalized order over connected vehicle data practices and NHTSA's consent order with crews for incomplete crash reporting disclosures are precisely the kind of events that transform governance from an internal preference into an external constraint. These are not just GM problems, they are governance events that can reshape regulatory expectations for the entire connected vehicle and automated driving field, making GM's proxy governance consequential beyond its shareholder base. Proxyopoly TM's overall conclusion is therefore unromantic. GM must modernize its governance at the same pace it modernizes its products. If it does, its Proxyopoly TM score can drift toward equilibrium. If it doesn't, then GM will continue to learn governance lessons the expensive way through regulators, consent orders, and courtroom calendars. And thus concludes the Proxyopoly TM score for General Motors Proxyopolists. And as always, it's now time for the final disclaimer. The professional opinions expressed in this podcast are property of Proxyopoly TM. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely communicative or educational entertainment purposes only. This Proxyopoly TM research report, in its verbalized or written form, is for informational objectives only, does not constitute investment advice, and shall not be misconstrued as a suggestion or an offer to buy or sell any securities. No generalist or sensationalist statements are intended or being made. Any resemblance to real-world events may be deliberate, though with GM's current trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than anticipated, while past performance is not indicative of future returns. And that's all the time we have, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying.